So in the last video, we made the sending of an image in the chat app, so we can click and see an image load. Now, the whole application's got nice, fading animations and loading animations, and this image is just appears, so it's not great. So we want to at least have some, animation in, and then potentially some loading symbols or something to indicate when a picture's loading. So right now you click, and after 2 seconds it just appears. So let's start by at least fading the image in when it gets loaded. We can do that fairly easily. What we'll do is we'll create a attached property to go onto the image, which is here, and then we'll simply hook into when the source changes, or when the actual image changes on the control, and then fade it in just like we do any other animation. So jump into the framework element animation attached properties class, which we should start separating soon, putting into its own subclasses. But for now, we'll dump one in here. So we want in here another class. I'll call this fade in image on load property, something like that. And we want the same base class, the animation base class, with the correct name. And this will fades in an image once the source changes. And we'll override the, in this case we don't just want to do animation, because we need to also change what happens when the value changes. So by default the value will change on load. So if we went to the animation base property class, by default we make it overridable, but by default when it's even in the base attached property, on value changed, so we only update the on value updated here rather. So when it loads we do all the animation. So let's override the value updated, not the value changed. So on value updated, we won't do what we do in the base, because we don't want to animate in this case when it loads. So we're simply ignoring all of that. We're redoing the logic for when the value is updated, and instead we want to first get the image, which equals the sender as image. Or in fact, we can do a check here. So if sender as image, or if sender is image, call it image, and then if it isn't, we just return. Make sure we have an image. So this attached property will only work on an image basically. And then once we get here, we'll have the image. So then we want to see if the value passed in is true. So if we want to animate in, then we just want to listen to the image's target updated. Now you've got two things. You've got target updated and you've got source updated, and we are updating the source. But the issue with the source updated is it literally means if this dependency property changes. Now when you bind a image with a source and you specify the path, it's either a bug in WPF or simply the expected behavior. But when you bind it in the code and you change the source, then it never fires the source updated. And I'm either guessing that's because it's a bug, or simply because WPF in the background updates the target and the source in code behind and never fires the event. So I'm suspicious it's a bug, but other people might, say, I don't know, it works. But if you can get it working with source, that's great. For me, I always use target updated on images, because that's when the actual underlying, the image itself changes regardless of who changed it and how. So you always get that fired. So basically, when the image changes, we'll fire this target updated. And if they specify false to the attached property, then we'll unhook. And we'll talk about, I mentioned in the last video, we'll start to have to look at, doing these events in a nicer way, maybe with some weak references or something, because these will ultimately cause some memory leaks that we'll have to fix later down the line because of, attaching a property true, hooking into event, and then never unattaching. So we'll have to deal with that in a later video, but it's not going to do anything harmful right now. It's perfectly fine. But we'll do some videos on detecting memory leaks and fixing, do events, and again, it's a whole new video. But just bear that in mind, that if some of you notice that, oh wait a minute, this might cause a memory leak, yeah, you're technically correct, but we'll fix that in future videos. It's not important. It's not going to stop the application working right now, but bear that in mind. So we have the animate in, and then we simply monitor for the target updated. So this is very similar to the base property, where it's a bit more complicated on the load, but we went through that. That really, on the first load we hide, and then we unhook the load, we wait a small delay, and then we do the animation. Whereas in this case, instead of doing all this logic on load and simply ultimately just calling do animation, we are going to completely ignore the do animation, and we're simply on value updated hooking into the target, and then here we want to just do an animation. So we know this is now going to be an image, so we just do sender as image, and then we can just animate it in using our animation helpers, or we should be able to. Fade in async, there we go. And first load, we just pass in false. And we can await that, I guess. And then we'll probably have to update the name. So fade in image. And then we attach this now to our image. And in theory, I think that should animate in, or rather fade in, or not. So the other thing actually saying that, I think we have to tell this to notify on target property update, I think is default to false. So set that to true, and that should now tell it that when the source changes via the target updated source as well. Let's try that again. There we go, so that fades in. So if we open up, you'll see the image fades in, so that's all right. That's a a nice animation when an image loads. The only thing is, it's just there and then appears. That we still, I think, need some kind of indication that is there an image loading. Where's the kind of, how do we know we're expecting an image, and where do we show if it's failed or not? There's no indication at all. So let's also add a I think we'll do the spinner that's on like the login buttons when you're loading. So on this, I just want to double check on value updated as the attached property. Yes, that's fine. Right, so I think where we'll want to put it, I think we did the spinning, what was it called? Spinning something. Spinning text it was called, and it was a text block style. So we want a text block, and we'll put it here. We'll have it sort of appearing when the image is loading, which we'll also have to detect. So let's start here. We'll do a text block with a style of spinning text. We'll want it aligned to the left and aligned to the top. So it's simply at the top left corner. In fact, horizontal alignment will want to be based on whether we center or not, and the alignment, which we've got somewhere else. Oh, and that reminds me, actually, I know something else I saw. Let me just cut this. One thing I noticed in the last video is the bubbles seem to stretch, like this one now. You see stretches to the width of the image, so we need to force that to realign. So let's do that, and then at the same time we want this text block to align the same as well. So it was sent by me, and horizontal alignment there. So we'll nick it off the chat bubble anchor. We'll go back to, we want this text, or rather this whole bubble thing here. So I think this, we either want to, I think we want to align this one, the whole grid. Let's see if that fixes the chat bubble. We'll also have a random loading glyph at the minute, I think now. So that's fixed that alignment thing there. You can see we've got this little animating glyph that's present on all of them at the minute, which we'll fix. So we want to align that one over to this side. So the same thing here, we'll just do the horizontal animation is the same, left or right. We'll also need to do foreground is foreground light. We'll add some padding. Now let's just take a quick look at how that looks at the minute. Oops. So ignore the fact that it's on all of them now, but that's what we'd get now when an image is loading for a specific message, which I think is subtle enough and nice enough. You could also add, you know, loading image or something, but I think just keeping it nice and simple, just a little spinner to show that something's loading is fine. So all we want to do now is make that only visible for one, when there's an image, and two, when the image is still loading. Because right now this spinner will be underneath here spinning behind the image. So we need to also make sure it only happens during an image loading and only if there is an image as well. So to do that, we'll need an image loaded on the image itself. So let's go to the view model first, which is chat message list item view model. And in the image attachment, we will have a public boolean image loaded, and this will be basically if this has been set. So right now it's null, so it'll be a simple case of local file path equals null. Otherwise we're going to say the image is loaded, and that's all we need to do. So indicates if an image has loaded. And now we combine to image loaded on image attachment. So in the text block, we want the visibility, or rather first, because we're binding to a property inside a property. So the view model is a chat message list item view model, which has the image attachment, and we want to bind to the image loaded inside of that. So you never want to really bind, you don't want to do like visibility is binding image attachment dot image loaded. I think we called it image loaded. So you don't really want to do that, because then this won't get notifications when this changes, or I'm pretty sure it won't. We can try that first, but I'm pretty sure when you do a double dot, effectively it hooks into the parents on property value changed. So it'll hook into the chat message list items on property value changed, and it will simply be monitoring if this whole thing changes, not the inner item. So we'll try it first to prove that, and then we'll fix it. So the visibility wants to be a converter to convert from a boolean to visibility gone converter, and it wants to be the opposite because we want it to be visible when image loaded is false. So we invert the logic. And also this is one, I've had a few questions, not many, but a few of you have asked, well, I don't understand the fallback value of binding. And this is an absolutely perfect example of what a fallback value is. So we're going to bind to an image attachment, which might be null. This might be null, and it is null on all the other messages. So this binding will effectively throw a null reference exception. It won't throw, because that binding won't do that. It'll simply end up being null, because it'll be caught and it'll resolve to null. So in this instance where this is not true or false, hence you can't pass it to a converter and do things because it's simply null, it's not a valid binding. The binding mechanism falls back to a specific, well, what do you do when it is null? It'll either return null, or you can override that value and pass in a valid value. So this is where the fallback value comes in. So fallback value will be set when this is incapable of being set. In this case, this is null, so it's not a valid binding. It's different from the what's the other one called? Target null value. So target null value will happen if this is a perfectly valid binding, i.e. this isn't null, but this value exists as well. It's a real value in the view model, but its actual value is null. In that case, target null is called, and that's what a lot of people think will happen when, say, this is completely invalid, like this is null, so you can't get into this value. People think that, well, I've set the the value null, target null value, and it's not being set. Well, it won't, because this is only set when the binding is valid, but the value is null. Fallback value is set when this binding is incapable of being fulfilled, i.e., like this part is actually non-existent, it's null, so you can't get into it. So in that case, if we basically have no image, it will cause a fallback value, which is perfect for us, because then in the instance that there is no image, we can tell this to be collapsed, because it won't pass into the converter. It will simply expect a value directly of visibility. So we'll tell it in the instance of effectively no image to be invisible as well. But then when there is an image, while this is false, show the loader. So the triple logic there should work. And I think this will show initially, but then when the image loads, due to that binding issue, it won't update. So you can see that's not updated there. So it's not even shown. So let's just fix that, as I'm saying, where you don't bind like this. You now change the data context to the image attachment, and then you bind to the inner image loaded. And this should now work as expected. So if we click this now, or not. Oh, hang on, it is, but we've got a big floaty spinner all the way around. And in fact, it's obviously still wrong because it's showing at the wrong time. So that should be, let's have a look. I think, let us first, what can we do here? Let's just set this opacity to 0 a minute so we can see the loading, where we're loading and what's going on here. Let's get this logic set up correctly. So there's nothing there, and then when that appears there is, so there's no height to this. Okay, so let's just make sure this isn't an issue. Let's just set this to top left. It's funny because this was working, and now we have, so what made this go wrong? Just step back and cut that out a minute. Let's see. Yeah, something's going wrong with that binding, because that's working, it's all lined up correctly. That's in the right place. So what happened between us pasting this in? Oh, I see. When we change the data context, we also change the sent by me alignment. So this needs to be, we can do, let's move this out and let us place this in just a border with horizontal alignment. So I'll simply plonk it into a parent to align correctly before we change the data context. It's always the only problem with changing the data context. You've got to make sure you only do it on the item you want. And we should be able to move the vertical alignment as well to the border. And this text block should hopefully still align. If not, then we can force the text block to align top left, because ultimately the border is aligned to the correct position. So let's just see if that works. So that works fine there. So now let's just put back in our binding and hopefully that will work. So we click, we've still got no load, but then it's appeared, we just simply got the logic back to front. It appeared once the image did. So this, I thought we inverted this logic. Image loaded. Have I done the wrong way around here? Oh, I did. Image loaded is loaded if it isn't equal to null, not if it is equal to null. That's that mystery explained. So finally, we click, we've got a little loading, and then the image fades in. So loading image fades in. And now it isn't in the background spinning. And we can double check that it isn't in the background and spinning, which we should do, by just simply setting, oh, in fact, that should have prevented the image from being visible. And it's still visible, which is interesting. Yeah, that is funny. Oh, because we've animated in, so we need to remove the fade in animation for the moment because that resets the opacity. And let's just double check that this does disappear when the image appears. So there you go, the image is now loaded but invisible, but the glyph is no longer there spinning. So we can place that back in now. Ooh. And I think that gives us a nice enough image loading kind of setup. So you're in a message, and then you can see something loading, and then it, you know, animates in. And if you scroll up, it'll effectively load below. So if you're in part of a message already and you're reading up here, then it won't, you know, interfere. It'll just load below. So I think that's good enough for an animation. Again, if you've got any feedback or you feel like you'd like to see something different or anything really, just let me know. But I think that's a nice enough and simple enough loading animation for images, and we can use that for other kinds of you know, content being loaded into the message. And that's that.